Canada, a longtime energy partner, has shut down the $13 billion oil export pipeline to the US, leaving Washington unable to respond in time. Canada stopped supplying oil and gas to the US. As the largest energy supplier to the US, Canada's decision to halt energy exports shocked Washington, immediately causing a surge in gas, oil, and electricity prices. This led to unprecedented disruptions in the lives of millions of Americans. How will Americans cope with the rising prices of essential goods, including fuel, food, and public services? From daily commutes to flights, everything is being affected. The aviation industry faces increased fuel costs, while transport, manufacturing, and many other sectors struggle due to soaring energy prices. The reason behind Canada's decision? For years, the US has imposed heavy trade tariffs on Canadian goods, believing that its neighboring country wouldn't dare to retaliate. But that belief is now shattered. Canada had long warned that this could happen, yet Washington paid little attention. Eventually, a strategic shift was made. Canada not only stopped oil exports to the US, but also signed long-term contracts with other countries, particularly China and India, the two largest energy markets in the world. This is not just a political reaction but also a long-term economic strategy to reduce dependence on the US. With these new agreements, Canada has opened the door to becoming one of the leading energy suppliers for major global economies. Europe and Asia are ready to replace the US. When the US suddenly loses its critical energy supply from Canada, who will step in to replace it? Europe and Asia have quickly stepped up. Canada has signed billion-dollar agreements to supply oil, gas, and electricity to countries in need of a stable energy source, especially Europe, which is seeking to replace energy supplies from Russia. At the same time, China and India have secured long-term agreements to ensure energy supplies for their rapidly growing economies. Canada's export ports and pipeline systems are now not only directed towards North America, but also shifting their energy flow towards Asia and Europe. This not only creates a massive shock for the US, but also completely changes the global energy balance. The US now faces not only an energy crisis, but also loses its strategic position in the international energy competition. With the loss of hydroelectric supply from Canada, states like New York, California, and Michigan are facing the risk of rolling blackouts, especially during the winter months. Electricity prices have soared, and some regions are even considering implementing peak hour usage restrictions to avoid overloads. Major industries such as automobile, steel, and food production are starting to cut production due to rising energy costs. This not only impacts the economy, but also threatens tens of thousands of jobs, particularly in energy-dependent sectors. Many businesses are facing severe profit declines, with some even closing down certain production facilities. This is forcing Americans to witness significant changes in their daily lives, from prices to job opportunities. The energy winter approaches. You've probably noticed the US is facing a challenging energy winter. Gas, oil, electricity, airline tickets, and goods have all surged in price. Families and businesses are shouldering unprecedented inflation, and everything is becoming more expensive than ever before. The electricity and fuel systems once dependent on Canada's supply are now paralyzed, rendering Washington's efforts almost futile. In reality, these events are forcing the US economy to face a significant shock, and it's hard to predict what will happen next. How many options does the US have left to deal with this crisis? Can Washington escape the energy crisis before it turns into a full-blown economic disaster? Meanwhile, Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. A rearmed Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe. The EU has just announced an 800 billion euro program for Readiness 2030, marking a turning point where allies are turning away from US weapons. Under Trump's leadership, several prominent voices linked to the defense establishment in Europe have suggested the US has built so-called kill switches into its aircraft, which would allow Washington to remotely deactivate or limit the combat functions of its allies. Many countries around the world are beginning to doubt the safety and stability of using US weapons. Concerns revolve around the possibility that the US could disable weapons sold to its allies, for example, by stopping the supply of spare parts or activating a remote kill switch. This not only causes concern in countries purchasing US weapons, but also serves as a wake-up call for America's strategic partners. As trust in the protection commitments from the Trump administration continues to decline, Rasmus Joff, the chairman of the Danish Defense Committee, has made a clear warning. We can no longer trust the US. He emphasized that purchasing weapons from the US poses a significant risk to national security, especially in the context where the US could use its allies' dependence on weapons as a tool of threat. Joff even expressed concerns that the US could demand Greenland, and if Denmark refuses, they might disable Denmark's weapons and allow Russia to attack. A serious warning about the potential threats faced by countries that do not comply with US demands. One of the biggest concerns is that the US might sell its allies' versions of weapons reduced by 10% in power. Trump himself openly stated at the White House that he would sell reduced power, toned-down versions of weapons to allied countries. He said, "We like to tone them down about 10%, which probably makes sense, because someday maybe they're not our allies, right?" This has led countries like Canada, Portugal, and France to reconsider their F-35 fighter jet orders, with some nations deciding to switch to purchasing weapons from European or Australian manufacturers. Not only countries outside of Europe, but even countries within the European Union are beginning to push back against US defense policies. With the Readiness 2030 program worth 800 billion euros, the EU is gradually shifting towards prioritizing weapons purchases from Europe. Japan and South Korea are making massive financial commitments, with an enormous 800 billion euros set aside for joint procurement among member states. This unprecedented sum signals a major shift in global defense strategy. In response, the European Union has decided to exclude both the United States and the United Kingdom from future defense plans. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed, "We need to prepare for a scenario where the US is no longer a strategic partner." This statement sends a clear signal. The EU is no longer dependent on the US but is instead building an independent defense force. Another indication of this strategic shift is Canada's decision to pivot towards Australia instead of continuing its cooperation with the US. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney recently announced a $6 billion Canadian partnership with Australia to develop an over-the-horizon long-range radar system. This marks a significant departure from traditional US-Canada defense collaborations, signaling that Canada is seeking alternative partners. Furthermore, the Trump administration's controversial puppy diplomacy in Greenland has drawn criticism. Usha Vance, wife of Senator J.D. Vance, visited Greenland as an unofficial representative, angering the Danish people. They emphasized that Greenland has been part of Denmark since 1380, twice as long as the United States has existed. Greenlanders have strongly opposed any suggestion of becoming part of the US, presenting a serious challenge to US foreign policy under Trump. The world is increasingly uniting against external pressures, defending sovereignty and freedom. International solidarity has become a key theme in recent years, particularly under the Trump administration, as nations face mounting challenges to their independence. From Mexico to Canada, no country is untouched by this struggle. However, one thing is clear. Global resistance against unilateral US influence is growing stronger. In Mexico, President Claudia Sheinbaum enjoys overwhelming public support, with an approval rating of up to 85% for her steadfast defense of national sovereignty. In the past 48 hours, more than 35,000 Mexican citizens have taken to the streets, protesting foreign government pressures and reaffirming their nation's independence. President Sheinbaum has made it clear, "We cannot let the decisions of foreign governments affect us. Our sovereignty is non-negotiable." Canada shares a similar stance. Once known for its peaceful diplomacy and international cooperation, Canada now faces serious challenges. Political leaders, from former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien to new Prime Minister Mark Carney, have strongly stated that Canada will never be part of the US. This is not just political rhetoric, but a reflection of national unity. Regardless of party affiliation, whether Liberal, Conservative, or New Democratic, Canadian politicians stand together in defense of their country's sovereignty. Across the Atlantic, European nations are also resisting US influence. Tensions with the Trump administration, from Brexit to trade disputes, have strengthened European unity. Leaders from France, Germany, Italy, and smaller nations have formed a united front, not only opposing US policies but also actively collaborating to build a fairer global order. Ukraine stands as a symbol of resilience in this struggle. Despite President Trump's reluctance to support Ukraine and his prioritization of personal interests, Ukraine has demonstrated unwavering strength. Under President Volodymyr Zelensky, the nation continues to fight for its sovereignty, earning widespread international support. Zelensky's approval rating has surged to nearly 70%, proving that Ukrainians stand united in their defense of democracy and national security. Never before has a US administration faced such global backlash. The Trump administration's conservative policies and perceived arrogance have alienated many allies. As nations push back against Washington's unilateral decisions, the US is becoming increasingly isolated on the world stage. Trump's erratic foreign policy, from threatening to sever ties with long-standing allies to imposing harsh trade measures, has significantly diminished America's international credibility. The situation in Greenland highlights this growing resistance. The Trump administration previously suggested purchasing Greenland, but the proposal was met with overwhelming opposition from both the government and the citizens of Greenland. They have made it clear they do not want to become part of the US. Their firm stance exemplifies how even small nations can defend their sovereignty against powerful external pressures. The world is at a turning point. Will smaller countries continue to assert their independence, or will we witness a major shift in global power dynamics? As the US faces growing resistance, the future of its alliances hangs in the balance. For decades, the US has dominated Canada's economy, with over 73% of Canada's exports flowing south. But for the first time in history, Canada is saying enough. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it crystal clear Canada will never be part of America. Could this be the beginning of a full-scale trade war between the US and its closest ally? The details coming up will shock you. Mark Carney is not your typical politician. He is a world-class economist who steered Canada through the 2008 financial crisis as Governor of the Bank of Canada. From 2013 to 20, he led the Bank of England, helping the UK navigate Brexit's economic turmoil. Now, as Canada's Prime Minister, Carney is making his stance clear. Canada must break free from US economic control. Unlike his predecessors, Carney does not engage in political games. He relies on data, strategy, and hard facts. This makes him a formidable challenge for Washington. In response to Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, and auto parts, Carney is striking back. Instead of capitulating, Canada is implementing countermeasures, including massive tariffs on US goods, expanding trade with the EU and BRICS nations, reducing reliance on the US, and investing heavily in renewable energy to challenge US oil dominance. If Canada succeeds, the US will lose one of its most critical trade partners. If other countries follow Canada's lead, this could trigger a major shift in the global economy. Carney's vision extends beyond trade. He seeks to reform the entire global financial system. In 2019, at the Jackson Hole Economic Summit, Carney warned that the world was too dependent on the US dollar. He proposed a new global currency system to reduce reliance on the dollar, possibly through a central bank-backed digital currency. If Carney's vision materializes, the US could lose its biggest economic advantage, the power of the dollar, altering global finance forever. The trade war between Mark Carney and Donald Trump is escalating, potentially reshaping the future of North America's economy. Trump has hit Canada with heavy tariffs on steel, lumber, and agricultural products, hoping to pressure Canada into submission. But Carney is not backing down. He is expanding trade partnerships with the EU, BRICS, and other global markets to lessen dependence on the US. He is also advocating for a new financial system where nations are not at the mercy of American monetary policy. Washington views this as a direct threat, with Trump and his allies on high alert. Markets are already reacting, with investors fearing prolonged economic instability. This battle is not just about trade. It is about control over North America's economic future. Neither side is willing to yield. Can the US afford to lose its strongest trading partner, or is it too late to prevent this economic rupture? Meanwhile, Canada is considering a drastic move, cutting power and oil supplies to the US. What would happen if Canada stopped supplying electricity and oil? The consequences could be devastating. Rising energy prices, widespread blackouts, and a major shock to the US economy. Canada provides nearly 40 terawatt-hours of electricity to the US annually, with states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota heavily reliant on this supply. Cutting exports could lead to higher electricity prices, potential blackouts, and disruptions to industries dependent on affordable Canadian energy. Beyond electricity, Canada supplies the US with 4 million barrels of oil per day, making up 67% of total US oil imports. If Canada reduces oil exports, the US energy market will face significant challenges. While the US has domestic reserves, many refineries are designed for Canadian heavy crude, making a quick switch to alternative suppliers difficult. Canada is already diversifying its energy exports, expanding trade with Asia, particularly China and Japan. With the Trans Mountain Expansion (TMX) pipeline operational in 2024, Canada can export larger oil quantities to non-US markets. If tensions escalate, As circuit, Canada may redirect its energy exports, leaving the US scrambling for alternatives. Can the US survive without Canadian energy? Or will this crisis force both nations back to the negotiating table before the damage becomes irreversible?